Rose Mitchell was 17 years old when her brother's wife told her she needed to find her own place. It was June 1885 in Cedar Ridge, Nebraska Territory, and Rose had exactly $15 she'd saved from 2 years working as a seamstress, plus a book about air circulation and convection her schoolteacher mother had left her before dying. Her mother had died from typhoid fever when Rose was 14. Her father had died a year later from injuries sustained in a farm accident. Rose had lived with her older brother William and his wife Helen for 2 years, contributing to household expenses by taking in sewing work. The arrangement worked until Helen became pregnant in spring 1885. Helen made the situation clear in May. They needed Rose's room for the nursery. Rose could stay through June, helping prepare for the baby. Then she needed to establish independent living. At 17, she was old enough to support herself. Rose had $15 and her mother's textbook on natural philosophy explaining heat, air movement, and convection. The book discussed how warm air rises and cool air sinks, creating circulation patterns, how buildings could be designed to use natural air movement for heating and cooling. Her mother, an educated woman who taught school before marrying, had used the book for teaching science. Rose filed a homestead claim on marginal land 3 miles from Cedar Ridge, a steep hillside facing south, considered poor for farming because of the slope. But the hillside offered something valuable: the ability to build a dugout at 2 different levels connected internally, using natural convection for heat distribution. Most dugout cabins were single-level spaces carved into hillsides. A room excavated horizontally into the slope with 1 entrance. Simple but thermally limited. Heat from a stove stayed near the ceiling. The floor stayed cold. Temperature varied dramatically top to bottom. Rose designed something different based on convection principles from her mother's book. She'd excavate 2 separate rooms at different elevations in the hillside, connected by an internal opening. The lower room would be the living working space with a small stove. The upper room, 8 feet higher in the hillside, would be the sleeping chamber. An opening between them would allow air circulation. The physics were elegant. Heat from the stove in the lower room would warm air. Warm air would rise through the connecting opening into the upper room. As that warm air cooled in the upper room, it would become denser and sink back down into the lower room through the same opening. Continuous circulation creating even temperature throughout both levels with 1 heat source. She had $15. Bought a good spade for $3, a pick for $2, a handsaw for $2, rope for $1, and kept $7 for lumber and emergency supplies. Walked to her hillside claim, carrying tools and her mother's textbook. The slope was indeed steep, approximately 40 degrees, perfect for vertical dugout construction. She'd excavate the lower room first at the base of the slope, then excavate the upper room 8 feet higher, then connect them internally. She began in mid-June, selected the excavation site carefully, south-facing for maximum sun exposure, stable clay soil that wouldn't collapse, good drainage to prevent water accumulation. Marked out the lower room dimensions: 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hill, 120 square feet. The excavation was brutal work for a 17-year-old working entirely alone with no assistance or encouragement from anyone. She'd dig into the hillside with spade and pick, attacking the clay soil that required both tools: spade for softer areas, pick for harder-packed sections and occasional rocks. Each bucket of removed earth weighed approximately 30 pounds when full. She'd fill the bucket, carry it out of the excavation, dump it 50 feet down slope to prevent runoff problems, return for another bucket. Endless repetition that destroyed her body incrementally. She had to create proper ceiling architecture to prevent collapse. Not a flat ceiling, but an arched shape, following natural compression lines in the earth. The same principle used in stone arch bridges. The arch distributed weight laterally to the walls rather than pressing straight down. This required careful excavation technique, removing earth precisely to create the curved shape, constantly checking the curve by eye and feel. The work pattern became relentless routine. Dig for 40 minutes, filling perhaps 4 buckets. Carry them out one at a time. 8 trips from excavation to dump site. Rest for 10 minutes with screaming back muscles and trembling arms. Return and repeat. 6 cycles per day meant 24 buckets, approximately 720 pounds of earth, moved daily in 30-pound increments. Progress was agonizingly slow by any measure. She could excavate maybe 2 cubic yards per day, working from dawn to dusk with brief breaks. The lower room required approximately 80 cubic yards total, 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep into the hill, averaging 7.5 feet high. Simple mathematics. 40 days of digging minimum if she maintained pace without injury, illness, or exhaustion forcing breaks. The physical toll was catastrophic for a 17-year-old. Her hands blistered within 3 days. The blisters broke and bled by day 5, making every shovel stroke agony. By day 7, thick calluses were forming over the damaged skin, creating protective layers that allowed continued work despite constant pain. Her back developed persistent spasms from the repetitive bending and lifting, spasms that woke her at night and made morning work nearly impossible until muscles warmed. She lost 15 pounds in the first month, despite eating as much as she could afford from her limited supplies. Caloric expenditure from manual labor exceeded intake every single day. Her face became gaunt, her arms visibly thinner, her work dress hanging loose on a frame that had been slim to begin with. People who saw her in town buying supplies barely recognized the educated seamstress transforming into an exhausted laborer. Sleeping on the ground beside her excavation meant no real rest. She'd wake multiple times nightly from back pain, from cold, from the simple discomfort of sleeping on hard earth with one thin blanket. Would force herself up at dawn, despite exhaustion, work until dark, collapse again into fitful sleep. The cycle continued day after day with no relief. The psychological toll was almost worse than the physical. Working alone meant no encouragement, no companionship, no validation, just endless digging in silence, except for her own breathing and the sounds of shovels striking earth. The community's mockery, people who saw her excavation and laughed, who told her she was wasting time, who said she'd fail, echoed in her mind during the lonely work hours. The community response was predictable mockery. Rose Mitchell was digging holes in a hillside, building a cave like an animal. The girl clearly had no sense, no future, no understanding of proper living. She'd fail within a month and come begging for domestic work in town. By late July, the lower room was complete. 10 by 12 feet, 8 feet high at the entrance, tapering to 7 feet at the back where it met the hillside. Smooth clay walls that held their shape well. She built a front wall of stacked sod blocks, installed a door, created one small window. The lower dugout room was functional. Now came the innovative part. She climbed 8 feet up the hillside and began excavating the upper room directly above and behind the lower room. Same dimensions, 10 by 12 feet, but positioned so it overlapped the lower room partially, allowing her to create an internal connecting opening between levels. The upper room excavation was even harder than the lower. She was working at elevation on a slope, removing earth that had to be carried down the hillside. The positioning had to be precise. If she miscalculated, the connecting opening wouldn't align properly. She measured constantly using ropes and stakes, ensuring the upper room floor would be exactly 8 feet above the lower room ceiling. By early September, both rooms were excavated. The moment of truth came when she broke through the earth between levels, creating a 3-foot-wide opening connecting the upper and lower chambers. She could stand in the lower room and look up through the opening into the upper room 8 feet above. Air flowed between the spaces immediately. She built a ladder connecting the levels, 6 rungs, allowing easy climbing between upper and lower rooms. built a front wall for the upper room with its own door and window, positioned 8 feet higher on the hillside. From outside, the structure looked like 2 separate dugout entrances on the slope. From inside, they were connected chambers designed for convection circulation. By late September, the dual-level dugout was complete. Lower room, living and working space with small cast-iron stove, basic furniture, entrance at hillside base. Upper room, sleeping chamber with bed, storage, entrance 8 feet higher. Opening connecting them, 3 feet wide, allowing air movement between levels. The community reaction was intense mockery. Rose had built 2 caves connected by a hole. The structure was absurd. Everyone knew heat rises. Putting the sleeping room above the heat source made no sense. The warm air would stay trapped in the upper room. The lower room would be cold. She'd freeze in winter. It proved she understood nothing about heating or construction. Rose knew better. She'd studied convection in her mother's textbook. Understood that air circulation required a complete loop, warm air rising, cool air sinking, continuous movement. The opening between levels allowed that loop. Warm air from the stove would rise into the upper room. As it cooled, it would become denser and sink back through the same opening into the lower room. Continuous circulation distributing heat evenly. She tested it in October, lit a small fire in the lower room stove. Within 30 minutes, she could feel warm air flowing up through the opening. Climbed to the upper room. It was warming from the rising air. The circulation pattern was working exactly as convection principles predicted. November brought cold weather. Temperature dropping to 15 degrees at night. Rose's dual-level dugout maintained remarkable temperature stability. A small fire in the lower room created warm air that rose into the upper room. The rising warm air displaced cooler air, which sank back down, was reheated by the stove and rose again. Continuous circulation meant both rooms stayed at 55 degrees with minimal fuel. Her neighbors in conventional single-level dugouts and cabins were burning wood constantly. Their homes showed the classic pattern: warm near the ceiling, cold near the floor, massive temperature variation from top to bottom. Rose's dual-level design eliminated that variation through forced convection circulation. People noticed her minimal wood consumption, drew wrong conclusions. The girl was cold, was suffering in her cave, was too proud to admit the dual-level design didn't work. December brought the blizzard that proved everything and saved 20 lives through Rose's understanding of convection and air circulation that most people dismissed as theoretical nonsense. The storm arrived December 18th, with the sudden violence that characterized Nebraska plains weather, where nothing blocked Arctic air masses flowing south across 1,000 miles of flat terrain. Morning started deceptively normal, 20 degrees with calm wind and clear skies, suggesting a typical December day. Rose completed her morning routine, checking both levels of her dugout, ensuring adequate firewood was stored inside, instinctively preparing, though she couldn't articulate why. By mid-morning, atmospheric conditions were shifting. Birds were absent. By noon, temperature had dropped to 0 degrees in 6 hours. The sky turned grey-white, with that color veterans recognized as extremely dangerous. By 2 p.m., the first snow began. Not gentle flakes suggesting gradual accumulation, but heavy, dense snow falling so thick it created whiteout conditions within 15 minutes. Visibility dropped to nothing. You couldn't see your own hand at arm's length, couldn't navigate by landmarks because landmarks disappeared in white static. The world became chaos, where direction meant nothing and disorientation killed people within minutes. Temperature continued its relentless plunge. 0 became -10. -10 became -20. -20 became -30 by evening. Wind built from 20 miles per hour to 40, then sustained at 60 miles per hour with gusts reaching 75. The combination of -30 degrees and 60-mile-per-hour wind created effective temperature approaching -75 degrees. Exposed skin froze solid in under 45 seconds. Breathing unprotected air damaged lungs immediately from ice crystal formation in airways. Walking outside meant risking death within 3 minutes if you couldn't find shelter immediately. Rose's dual-level dugout barely registered the external temperature catastrophe happening outside. The massive insulation from Earth surrounding both chambers on all sides meant external conditions became largely irrelevant. She was living inside the hillside, protected by thousands of tons of earth that maintained constant temperature regardless of surface weather. She lit her small stove in the lower room around 6 p.m. as darkness fell and temperature outside approached -30. The warm air from the stove immediately began rising through the 3-foot opening into the upper chamber. The convection loop activated naturally. Warm air rising displaced cooler air in the upper room, which sank back through the same opening into the lower room, where it was reheated and rose again. Continuous circulation, distributing heat perfectly between levels. The temperature differential between outside and inside intensified the convection effect. Greater temperature differences create stronger convection currents. As outside temperature dropped to -30, the natural circulation in Rose's dugout accelerated. Warm air rose faster, cool air sank faster. The loop worked more efficiently under extreme conditions, exactly when it was needed most. Both chambers maintained 60 degrees with one small fire burning minimal fuel. The lower room stayed at 58 to 60 degrees. The upper room, receiving the rising warm air first, stayed at 60 to 62 degrees. A 4-degree difference maximum. Trivial variation compared to the 20-degree spreads common in single-level structures. Her neighbors were suffering catastrophically. The Patterson family's single-level dugout couldn't maintain 45 degrees despite burning wood continuously. The cold air pooled on the floor where their children sat. The ceiling was warm, but the floor was nearly freezing. Classic failed convection. The Morrison cabin was worse. Rectangular above-ground construction that wind attacked from all sides. They were burning wood desperately, consuming their winter supply at unsustainable rates, watching interior temperature drop despite maximum heating. The Henderson family's dugout had a different problem. Good insulation from earth, but poor air circulation. The area near their stove was hot, over 70 degrees. The corners far from the stove were under 40 degrees. Massive temperature variation across the space. Their children were huddling near the stove to stay warm. At midnight, Sarah Patterson came through the storm to Rose's dugout, found the lower entrance, and pounded desperately. Rose opened the door. Inside was warm, with even temperature throughout. Sarah, frost-covered and barely coherent, managed to speak. "Our children are hypothermic on the floor. Our dugout won't warm evenly. Can we shelter here?" The Patterson family, parents and 5 children, crowded into Rose's lower room. 7 people plus Rose. Then Rose showed them the ladder to the upper room. "Children can sleep up there. It's warmer because heat rises. Adults can stay down here near the stove." The Patterson children climbed to the upper room and found it genuinely warm. Warmer than the lower room because warm air accumulated there before circulating down. The parents stayed in the lower room near the stove. The convection circulation meant both spaces stayed comfortable. Within 2 hours of the Patterson family's arrival, desperate pounding announced more refugees. 4 more families had made the dangerous journey through killing conditions to reach Rose's dugout. The Morrisons, whose rectangular above-ground cabin was being destroyed by wind force. They'd heard boards cracking, felt walls flexing inward. New structural failure was imminent. The Hendersons, whose single-level dugout demonstrated the fatal flaw of poor convection, 70 degrees near the ceiling, where heat accumulated uselessly. 40 degrees on the floor, where their children sat developing hypothermia despite being indoors with a fire burning. The Wilson family arrived nearly dead from exposure. They'd tried to outlast the storm in their cabin, but temperatures had dropped so catastrophically they'd been forced to evacuate. John Wilson was carrying their youngest daughter, who'd stopped responding verbally, showing dangerous late-stage hypothermia signs. His wife, Margaret, was dragging two older children who could barely walk. The young Baker couple, newlyweds who'd homesteaded in fall and built a hasty cabin, came last. Their structure had proven completely inadequate for extreme weather. By 3 a.m., 20 people were crowded into Rose's dual-level dugout. The organization was organic and brilliant. 12 children climbed the ladder to the upper sleeping chamber, where rising warm air kept temperature at 62 degrees consistently. They layered together on Rose's bed and floor, youngest in warmest center positions, older children wrapping around them protectively. The warmth was remarkable. Children who'd been showing hypothermia symptoms recovered within 30 minutes in the upper chamber's warm, rising air. 8 adults remained in the lower room around the stove, sitting with backs against the earth walls that radiated stored heat. The convection loop continued working flawlessly under maximum stress. One small fire in the lower room. Warm air rising through the connecting opening, cool air sinking back down to be reheated. Continuous circulation maintaining both chambers at comfortable temperature with minimal fuel. "This is impossible," James Henderson said, looking up at the opening to the upper room where he could see his children settling in warmth. "We have earth insulation in our dugout. Same clay walls, same protection from wind, but we can't maintain even temperature. The ceiling area is hot, the floor is freezing. Our children huddle near the stove because that's the only warm spot. You have 2 rooms, and both are evenly warm. How is this working?" Rose climbed the ladder and gestured for James to follow. They stood in the upper chamber among the settling children. "Feel the air," Rose said. "It's moving, always moving. Warm air rises from below through that opening. When it reaches this upper chamber, it spreads out, cools slightly, becomes denser, and sinks back through the same opening. That circulation is called a convection loop." She led him back to the lower chamber. "Your dugout has warm air that rises to the ceiling and stays there. No place for it to go, no circulation path. The heat accumulates uselessly at the top, while cold air pools at the bottom. My design creates a vertical path up through the opening, cool in the upper chamber, sink back down, reheat, rise again. The air moves continuously, distributing warmth evenly." James Henderson stood watching the convection demonstration, placing his hand near the opening, feeling warm air flowing upward, then feeling cooler air at the edges flowing back down. The physics were undeniable, visible, testable. He was witnessing natural convection, creating perfect heat distribution with zero mechanical assistance. "My God," he said quietly, "it's so simple. Warm air rises, cool air sinks. If you give them a path, they circulate naturally. We've been building wrong for years, fighting convection instead of using it." The blizzard lasted 40 hours. Through all of it, 20 people stayed warm in the dual-level dugout using minimal fuel. The structure everyone mocked, the girl digging 2 caves connected by a hole, was saving lives through superior thermal design while conventional structures failed. When the storm ended December 20th, families returned to find their homes cold despite having burned enormous fuel quantities. Rose's dual-level dugout had maintained comfortable temperature in both chambers, with one small fire creating natural convection circulation. William Mitchell, Rose's brother, who'd asked her to leave, came to the hillside dugout on December 21st. Stood looking at the 2 entrances 8 feet apart vertically on the slope, at the structure he'd called absurd, at the dwelling that had saved 20 lives, including families he'd known since childhood. He descended to the lower entrance, was invited in, climbed the ladder to see the upper room. understood immediately how the convection loop worked. "I was completely wrong," he said, "about everything. I thought you were building poorly because the design seemed backward. Sleeping room above the heat source. I didn't understand you'd created a circulation system. This is brilliant engineering. I'm sorry I didn't help you. Sorry I assumed you'd fail." The community transformed overnight from mockery to fascination, from dismissing Rose's dual caves as absurdity to recognizing them as superior engineering based on physics most people had never studied. William Mitchell, Rose's brother, who'd asked her to leave, came to the hillside dugout on December 21st after the storm cleared, and he'd heard what happened from the Patterson family. He walked around the structure, examining both entrances, the lower door at the hillside base, the upper door 8 feet higher on the slope. The external appearance was unremarkable. 2 dugout entrances, nothing suggesting innovation. He knocked at the lower door. Rose invited him in. He descended the 5 steps into the lower chamber and felt immediate warmth despite no fire burning, the thermal mass of the surrounding earth still releasing stored heat hours after the stove had gone cold. Then Rose showed him the ladder, and he climbed to the upper room. Standing in the upper chamber, looking down through the 3-foot opening at the lower room below, William suddenly understood the brilliance of the design. "It's a chimney," he said slowly. "Not for smoke, but for air. Warm air rises like smoke rises, but instead of escaping outside, it comes to this upper room, then cools and falls back down. You've created a permanent circulation system using just the natural behavior of air." "And that's exactly it," Rose confirmed. "Mother's textbook called it convection. Hot air expands and rises, cool air contracts and sinks. If you create a vertical path, they circulate continuously. One fire heats both chambers because the air moves between them carrying heat." William sat down heavily on Rose's bed, not from exhaustion but from the weight of understanding how wrong he'd been. "I told Helen you were building foolishly. Said putting the sleeping room above the heat source made no sense because heat rises and you'd trap all the warmth up here. I didn't understand that was the point. Let heat rise here, let it cool, let it fall back to be reheated. I'm sorry I didn't help you. Sorry I thought education made you impractical when it actually made you smarter than all of us." The valley needed to understand what had actually happened. Not just that Rose's dugout had saved lives, but why it had worked when conventional structures had failed. Margaret Foster, a school teacher who'd been skeptical of Rose's design, organized a gathering in late December specifically for Rose to explain convection principles to the community. Rose stood before 50 townspeople and taught physics most of them had never considered. She brought her mother's natural philosophy textbook and read passages about heat and air movement, drew diagrams on a slate board showing warm air rising, cool air sinking, circulation loops forming when vertical paths existed. "Single-level dwellings fight convection," she explained. "Heat rises to the ceiling and stays there because there's nowhere else for it to go. The floor stays cold because cold air is denser and sinks. You get a permanent temperature difference, warm ceiling, cold floor. My dual-level design works with convection instead of fighting it. Gives rising warm air somewhere to go, the upper chamber. The warm air cools there, becomes dense again, sinks back to the lower chamber where it's reheated. Continuous movement distributing heat evenly." She showed calculations from her mother's textbook about BTU requirements and air volume. Both chambers together are 240 square feet, double a single-level dugout the same size as my lower room. But because convection distributes heat perfectly, I need less total heating than a single-level space. The circulation means every cubic foot of air is heated efficiently. No hot spots, no cold spots, just even temperature throughout. At 17, Rose became the region's expert on convection heating design. The concept seemed complicated, but the physics was straightforward. Create vertical separation, connect the levels, allow air circulation. Natural convection distributes heat more efficiently than any single-level design. Rose lived in her dual-level dugout for 7 years. At 19, she formally filed her homestead claim. At 24, she received title to 80 acres. The marginal hillside land nobody wanted became valuable property, demonstrating advanced thermal engineering. She married at 25 to a schoolteacher who appreciated her scientific knowledge. They built a larger, dual-level house using refined convection principles, raised 4 children, teaching them that understanding physics creates better solutions than following convention. The original dual-level dugout still exists, maintained by the Nebraska Historical Society. Modern thermal analysis confirms what Rose proved in 1885. Vertical separation with connecting openings creates natural convection loops that distribute heat more evenly than single-level designs. The dual-level dugout maintained temperature variation of less than 5 degrees between levels, compared to 20-degree variations in conventional structures. The historical marker reads, Rose Mitchell Anderson, 1868 to 1947. Homesteader who designed dual-level dugout using natural convection principles. Structure sheltered 20 people during 1885 blizzard using superior heat distribution. Demonstrated practical application of air circulation physics to frontier architecture. The real story is about a 17-year-old who built 2 caves connected by a hole and saved 20 lives because she understood that heat rises and cool air sinks, creates circulation when you design the path correctly. Who knew her schoolteacher mother's textbook on natural philosophy contained better building advice than conventional frontier wisdom? Because sometimes the girl building caves in a hillside understands convection better than people building normal cabins. The structure everyone mocked was actually superior engineering using free natural air movement to distribute heat perfectly.